Good evening. All right. We're going to get right into things this evening. Got a pretty good amount of material to cover. And hopefully I'll do a little better job with my slides this time. Last week we spent the majority of our time talking about man's sin and the global flood. We talked about how the global flood, it's one of those stories that is, we teach to our children right off the bat. I mean, it's one of the first things they learn. But yet, it is also one of the most criticized accounts in history. We know that Adam and Eve were given the command to avoid eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And as every student of the Bible understands and knows, Adam and Eve transgressed against that law and ate the forbidden fruit. And for this sin, they were evicted from the garden, and a curse was placed upon them. And then outside of the garden, there was pretty much a total rebellion against God. So at that point, the stage was set for God's wrath upon a sin-sick world. And his decree was that he would destroy man, beast, and bird from the face of the earth. Wow, getting hot now. Numerous theologians and scientists throughout history have attributed many of the earth's features to the flood of Noah. And they were generally in agreement with the Bible's teachings on the creation and the flood. But that's really not the case anymore. Back this off a little bit. In our current day and age, and basically since probably the 60s and 70s is when it's really taken a turn. We're bombarded with the evolutionary concept, and that is pretty much all that's taught now to our children, and that is the evolutionary geology. But the simple fact of the matter is that it is impossible to correlate the Bible with evolutionary geology. It just can't happen. There have been many that have actually tried to blend them, to come up with a hybrid, but it can't happen. We talked about how in Genesis 7, verse 11, how it provides a very clear indication of the devastating nature of the flood when it states that all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of the heaven were opened. Throughout the years, various critics have suggested that the deluge mentioned here was not a worldwide event, but it was a local event, a local flood. But the biblical text does indeed, it doesn't need any substantiation from anywhere else, because it clearly disposes of the question of the universality of the flood. The earth was completely covered by water. We then talked about the testimony of the Apostle Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 7. And further, we talked about the testimony of Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 17. It was not just the inspired writers of the Bible who provided information on the extent, the nature, and the importance of the Genesis flood. The Lord himself addressed the topic in Luke chapter 17. We then talked about just a logical or common sense thought that if the flood were a local flood and not a global flood, why would it be necessary to build an ark? Noah could have just guided all the animals away from the local flood. So we're going to move further in tonight. We're actually going to talk about the geologic timetable and the age of the earth. And tonight's going to seem like you're going back into junior high for science class. But there are some very interesting points that we can make by looking at some of the things that are the evidence that nobody disputes exists. They just interpret it in different ways. And we're going to look at some of that tonight. One of which you can see right there in front of you. Hopefully that shows up okay. And that is the Grand Canyon. It's frequently described as one of the most awe-inspiring and spectacular natural features on the face of the earth. Listed as one of the seven natural wonders of the world, it became a national park in 1919, and in 1979 was named a World Heritage Site. That is a designation reserved only for those places that are considered to have universal value for all of humankind. Because of its sheer size, the origin of this natural beauty has been the object of a great deal of speculation. Theories regarding the geological events that led to the present canyon are as abundant as the visitors to the South Rim. To the man on the street, one of the most impressive arguments for an ancient Earth is the testimony of these sedimentary rock layers that, many of which are thousands of feet thick, are strewn about the planet, including evidenced in the Grand Canyon. Scientists, even park rangers, subject us to examples like the Grand Canyon and present their spiel so effectively that as we observe those layers of sedimentary rocks piled on top of one another, the only explanation that seems possible is that vast amounts of time must have been involved for those layers, as seen there, to form. Each section of the rocks, we are told, represents a time eons ago and an ancient world that long since has ceased to exist. Evolutionists contend or argue that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Further, they allege that for the past 3 billion years or so, life has evolved gradually from simple organisms to those that are more seemingly complex. One of the methods of presenting this idea is by means of the so-called geologic timetable, which you see pictured there. It kind of shows up. While it may sound surprising, the standard geologic column was actually devised prior to 1860 by catastrophists who considered themselves creationists. The timetable is a common feature in most textbooks dealing with geology, biology, paleontology, etc. And it proposes to show the development of living creatures in ascending order from the simple to the complex, from the ancient past to the present. And while it certainly looks good on paper or even on screen, the actual evidence tells a different story. Much of the controversy today is between creationists and evolutionists. It centers on the age of the earth. A large part of that controversy has to do with the fact that there's no compromise that will allow the old earth, young earth scenarios to coexist. The gulf separating those two viewpoints, the biblical and evolutionary views, it's just too large. You cannot bridge it. Marshall and Sandra Hall, in their book, The Truth, God or evolution, recognized this fact when they observed it is not easy to overthrow a belief, however absurd and harmful it may be, which your civilization has promulgated as the scientific truth for the better part of a century. The Halls continued by saying, time, as poets and insurance salesmen remind us, is the enemy of life. But time has its friends too. Without great, incomprehensible, immeasurable stretches of time to fall back on, the evolutionists would be sitting ducks for the barbed queries of even high school students. Time is the evolutionist's refuge from the slings and arrows of logic, scientific evidence, common sense, and the multiplication table. The point is well made there. It's difficult to overthrow a belief that has been taught as the scientific truth for so long. And it is especially difficult to overthrow such a concept when an entire world view it's based on it. I was talking to someone just a couple weeks ago and after the class, and we were talking about how it has changed so much that when I was in junior high school, it was still being taught as the theory of evolution. Whereas now it's taught as fact. There is no theory put with it unless it's a TV show that you see about the Big Bang. It's not presented as theory anymore. But when all of the evidence is considered, it really does not bode well for the evolutionists, for their claim of an ancient earth and universe. The actual evidence firmly supports the concept of a young earth. And we're going to look at some of those tonight. Evolutionists have divided the geologic column, which I'll go back to it here so you can see it, have divided the geologic column into a hierarchical system of eons, eras, periods, and epochs. The two major eon divisions are the Precambrian, which run from 590 million to 4.5 billion years ago, and the Phanerozoic, 590 million years to the present. The three major eras of the Phanerozoic are the Paleozoic, referred to as the age of the trilobites, which includes the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian periods. Then we have the Mesozoic, referred to as the age of the dinosaurs, which includes the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And then we have the Cenozoic, referred to as the age of the mammals, which includes the Tertiary and Quaternary periods. Many of us have been taught that the geologic column proves that evolution is true and that the earth is extremely old. Actually, the geologic column provides extraordinary evidence, which demonstrates that evolution is not true and the earth is not ancient. So let's consider some of this evidence, like out-of-place fossils. According to the evolutionary hypothesis, man, or Homo sapiens, appears near the top of the geologic column. Man's history, therefore, represents but a tiny fraction, approximately 1/1000th of the geologic record. To the evolutionist, it's inconceivable that evidence of human habitation could exist in the earlier periods of the column. Yet there are many examples of these out of place and even out of date fossils that undermine the theory of evolution. For example, several years ago, evolutionist Albert G. Ingalls, who was the state geologist of Kentucky, was working in the coal veins within Kentucky and nearby states. And while there, he stumbled across human-like footprints embedded in the coal veins in those states. I believe I have a picture of that. There. Coal, of course, as we're taught, is supposed to have been laid down during the so-called Carboniferous period, which allegedly is separated from mankind by 250 million years, according to the standard geologic timetable. So how then could a human footprint possibly occur in coal? Dr. Ingalls did not discover these footprints just in Kentucky. He also found them in Missouri, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and even westward toward the Rocky Mountains. A.E. Wilder Smith of the United Nations examined the tracks, and he reported to it this way. The tracks are in formations considered to be Upper Carboniferous, 250 million years old, and show 5 toes and an arch, which is unquestionably human. The tracks are 9.5 inches long and 4.1 inches broad at the heel. The width at the forward end of the track by the toes was 6 inches. The being that left the tracks was a biped that walked upright like a human. Dr. Ingalls was invited by the editors of Scientific American to write an article to explain away these tracks. He accepted, and in the January 1940 issue, under the title of The Carboniferous Mystery, he wrote, I don't have that one. If man or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape's ancestors, early mammal ancestor, existed as far back as the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so completely wrong that all geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud in the Carboniferous period with his feet. Science rejects the attractive explanation. Since when? Science is systematized. It systematized knowledge derived from the observation and collection of data. Scientists don't just reject the data simply because they do not feel that it fits their current reigning theory. Rather, they reject the theory and abandon it or modify it so it fits the new incoming data. That's how it normally works. And it works like that in every area of science except one. And that one area is where evolution is concerned. Further, in 1936, a metal hammer with a wooden handle was dug out of a Cretaceous limestone, which is dated by evolutionists at 135 million years old. It was found in the area near London, Texas. The hammer's broken handle is 6 3/4 inches long, and the hammer itself is made of a very strong metal. When the surface oxidation was removed, the metal was still shiny. How did something like that get embedded in the rock from 135 million years ago? Think about the trilobite. We've all heard about these. It's a small marine arthropod with a hard exoskeleton, and it is considered very important as to be classified as an index fossil, representing the earliest period of the Paleozoic era, the Cambrian. Evolutionist J.E. O'Rourke, in a paper in the American Journal of Science titled "The Pragmatism versus Materialism in Stratigraphy," he discussed the use of index fossils to determine the geologic age of the formation. And he noted that the methodology involved, it starts from a chronology of index fossils and imposes them on the rocks. Each taxon represents a definite time and so provides an accurate, even infallible date. If you doubt it, bring in a suite of good index fossils, and the specialist, without asking where or in what order they were collected, will lay them out on a table in chronological order. In other words, the assumption that evolution is true is used to place index fossils in the appropriate order from simple to complex. The index fossils then are used to date the layers in order to prove that evolution is true. If this sounds like circular reasoning, it is. O'Rourke went on to admit, the intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling the explanations are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings results. This is supposed to be hard-headed pragmatism. The rocks to date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning if it insists on using only temporal concepts, because circularity is inherent in the derivation of timescales. As one scientist noted, the dating of the rocks depends on the evolutionary sequence of the fossils, but the evolutionary interpretation of the fossils depends on the dating of the rocks. It's no wonder the evolutionary system to outsiders implies circular reasoning. No wonder indeed. Trilobites allegedly flourished 500 million years before man ever arrived on the scene. On June 1st, 1968, however, evolutionist William Meister, an amateur fossilologist, was working near Antelope Springs in Utah, and he made a discovery that was destined to dispel that incorrect evolutionary supposition. When he was working his way up the side of a mountain some 2,000 feet to a ledge above, he broke open a slab of rock with his hammer to investigate it for fossils. And imagine his astonishment when he saw on one side the footprint of a human with trilobites right in the footprint itself. And I'm sure that is really hard to see with the resolution here. The other half of the rock showed an almost perfect mold of a footprint in fossils. Amazingly, the human was wearing a sandal as they examined. Numerous other fossilized human footprints from both adults and children have since been found in the area, as well as dinosaur prints. The contemporaneousness of man and the trilobite effectively collapsed in 500 million years of the geologic column, just with this evidence. Additionally, fossilized animals, including chordate fish, appear in the fossil record fully formed and distinct. No ancestral forms can be found in deeper layers for animals such as the protozoans, arthropods, brachiopods, mollusks, bryozoans, coelurotherates, sponges, annelids, and ectoderms or chordates, suggesting an abrupt beginning, i.e. creation, rather than the descent from a common ancestor through evolution. If space permitted, in time in this class, we could present much more additional information on such anomalies, if you will, to show that much of the geologic column is a figment of the evolutionist's imagination. Consider some of these contradictions as composed by Eric von Funge. Fossil leather, sole imprint, with a double line of sewed stitches found in the Triassic rock, estimated to be 225 million years old. Fossil sole imprint with visible sewed thread in coal, estimated at 15 million years old. Flint carvings on extinct saurian or reptilian bones estimated to be 180 million years old. Well, let's talk about polystrate fossils. Embedded in sedimentary rocks all over the globe are what are known as polystrate fossils. Polystrate means many layers and refers to fossils that cut through at least two sedimentary rock layers. Probably the most widely recognized of the polystrate fossils are the tree trunks that extend vertically through 2, 3, or more sections of rock that supposedly were laid down in epochs covering millions of years. However, organic materials such as wood, as seen here, that is exposed to the elements, will not fossilize. Thus, the entire length of these tree trunks must have been preserved quickly, which suggests that the sedimentary layers surrounding them must have been deposited rapidly, possibly and likely during a single catastrophe. As Paul Ackerman has suggested, they constitute a sort of frozen time clock from the past, indicating that terrible things occurred, not over millions of years, but very quickly. Further, tree trunks like this are not the only representatives of polystrate fossils. In the state of Oklahoma, geologist John Morris studied limestone layers containing fossilized reed-like creatures known as calamites that range from 1 to 6 inches in diameter. Dr. Morris noted these segmented stems were evidently quite fragile once dead, for they are usually found in tiny fragments. Obviously, the limestones couldn't have accumulated slowly and gradually around a still-growing organism, but must have been quite rapidly deposited in a series of underwater events. At times, even animals' bodies form polystrate fossils, like catfish in the Green River Formation in Wyoming. Probably the most famous is the fossilized skeleton of a whale discovered in 1976 near Lompoc, California. The whale is covered from diatomaceous earth, and diatoms are microscopic algae. As they die, their skeletons form deposits, a process that evolutionists say is extremely slow. But the whale, which is more than 7 feet thick, is lying on its back and is completely covered by the diatomaceous earth. There's simply no way the whale could have remained on its back for hundreds of years while diatoms covered it, because it would have decayed or been eaten by scavengers. Trees, reeds, catfish, and other organisms with which the fossil record abounds did not die and lie around hundreds, thousands, or millions of years while slowly being turned into polystrate fossils. Truth be told, polystrate fossils testify loudly to a young Earth whose layers formed rapidly and not very long ago. So, what about some scientific evidence for a young Earth besides that? Evolutionists contend that things happen now just like they happened in the past, an idea known as uniformitarianism. The catchphrase is, "The present is the key to the past." In looking at the Earth around us, some of the numbers that evolutionists have given us, they just don't add up. Evolutionists proclaim that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, but we can look at a few of our treasures that we have around the world. One of these you'll recognize here, Niagara Falls. It's a waterfall located on the border of New York and Ontario, Canada. Erosion has been slowly pushing the waterfall about 7 miles upstream, forming the Niagara Gorge. Before large water diversion projects were built in the 1950s and 1960s, The falls were receding at a rate of more than 3 feet per year. If the Earth were 4.6 billion years old, and the falls have been, as evolutionists say, eroding at the same 3 feet every year, that means the original location of the waterfall should have been about 13.5 billion feet further upstream. Kind of hard to do considering the circumference of the Earth is only 132 million feet. Think about the Mississippi River. As the Mississippi River flows down towards the Gulf of Mexico, it picks up dirt and sediment. It's just doing this now with all the flooding. Picks it up from the riverbanks along the way. Approximately 300 million cubic yards of sediment are deposited into the Gulf of Mexico by the Mississippi River each year. If the Earth really has been around as long as evolutionists say, then the sediments deposited from the Mississippi River would have completely filled the Gulf of Mexico long ago. American humorist Mark Twain commented on this type of reasoning in his classic work, Life on the Mississippi. He said, in the space of 176 years, the lower Mississippi has shortened itself 242 miles. This is an average of a trifle over 1.33 miles per year. Therefore, any calm person who is not blind or idiotic can see that in the old Olympic Silurian period, just as 1 million years ago next November, when he wrote this, the lower Mississippi was upwards of 1,300,000 miles long and stuck out over the Gulf of Mexico like a fishing pole. And by the same token, any person can see that 742 years from now, the lower Mississippi will be only 1.75 miles long, and Cairo, Illinois, and New Orleans will have joined their streets together and be plodding comfortably along under a single mayor and a mutual board of aldermen. There is something fascinating about science. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. Well put. Okay, here we have the Colorado River. Evolutionists believe that the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River, which, as you can see there, is a small amount of water, but it was over a very long period of time. The problem with this theory is that there are over 900 cubic miles of dirt missing from the end of the river. Just like with the Mississippi, that dirt gets carried somewhere. If the small Colorado River formed the canyon, what happened to the 900 cubic miles of dirt? Could this have been the result of a catastrophe like the flood? Clearly, the evolutionary timescale prescribed for the Earth does not fit the facts. So, while evolutionists frequently appeal to the geologic column in their attempts to document an old Earth and to substantiate the theory of evolution, the actual facts of that column do not support either the column or the idea of an ancient Earth. But once again, that is the one scientific field where data and facts don't necessarily have anything to do with the theories. And that is where we'll wrap it up for tonight. Next week, we're going to start talking about dinosaurs, science, and the Bible. Thank you for your time.